Greetings, vinyl community. I've had a request, and this request came from Lise, whose channel is LE, and she asked that I do a video on Jethro Tull, and I'm delighted to comply. So today I'm talking about my first exposure to Jethro Tull in 1970 with the album that came out in spring of that year, their third album, Benefit. First exposure to this was hearing some tracks on the radio. I'm not sure exactly which they were, but it was before the album was released. One of them was certainly the opening track, With You There to Help Me. And each song was so attractive, I knew that this was an album I was really going to be interested in. So I picked it up shortly after it was released. The album is officially credited to the same lineup that appeared on the second album, Stand Up, which was frontman Ian Anderson, plus Martin Barre on lead guitar, Glenn Cornick on bass, and Clive Bunker on drums. However, this was actually the work of a five-piece band. This was the first album on which John Evan joined in on keyboards, although he's credited as a guest. Specifically, it says piano and organ played by John Evan for our benefit. John Evan was originally in a band with Ian Anderson and Glenn Cornick, as well as other future Jethro Tull members before Jethro Tull. It was known as the John Evan Band, or the John Evan Smash. Apparently, John got to be the title bearer because his mom let the band rehearse at their home. The first recording that John Evan made with Jethro Tull was the single, released at the beginning of 1970, Witch's Promise, backed with The Teacher. And this was released in Britain with a picture sleeve for the first time in that country on the Chrysalis label. Actually, I think they were still officially Island, using the Island catalog numbers, but the Chrysalis logo. Now on the album cover, we see the band as stand-up figures. It sort of seems to carry over from the previous album, Stand Up, which showed the band as stand-up figures in the gatefold that emerged when the album was opened. And Clive Bunker has suggested that because this album design was the idea of their manager, Terry Ellis, that perhaps he was seeing the band as little puppets that he could manipulate at will, while the real band is stuck outside looking in through the window, not really in control. The back cover shows the behind-the-scenes manipulation of the little figures. Fold here. The album does have a very dark feel. The songs are either sardonic or tinged with regret. For a man who was all of 22 years old when this album was released, Ian Anderson seems to do a lot of looking back on life with a rueful feeling, a feeling of weariness. Even so, the album begins with a sort of laughing sound. Ian Anderson fades in on the flute, sort of laughing, cackling into the flute, but it's not a joyful laughter. It's a bit of that sardonic sound as the song proper becomes a bit of a dirge, but decorated by the different layers of flute. There's a backwards flute going on. Ian Anderson had a trick when he would perform this song on stage in later years of announcing that he was going to reproduce the backwards flute track live. And he would do that by picking up the flute, stepping up to the microphone, and turning his back. Second song on the album, very much a one of those weariness songs, Nothing to Say, and is very explicit about saying that I went your way 10 years ago and I've got nothing to say. Now, that's clearly projecting into the mindset of an older man because 10 years ago in real life, Ian Anderson would have been 12. There is a difference between the album as released in America, which is what I'm showing here, and the album as originally intended and released in the UK. And that comes up with the next track, which is Inside. Inside is probably the only really happy song on the whole album, and it is a very wonderful and joyful song. It was moved on the American album from side 2, where it was on the original, to side 1. On the original album, the track that should be the third song is Alive and Well and Living In, which is another very dark song. A song about a woman who seems to be very depressed and doesn't want to answer the phone, doesn't want to go anywhere, just wants to be inside where no one can see her. But the inside of the song Inside is a very happy inside of Ian and his wife and their friend Jeffrey. There's Jeffrey, who is mentioned on one song on each of the first 3 albums before he actually joined the band with the Aqualung album. But the Inside song is just a celebration of domestic happiness in a very simple and positive way. A very favorite line of mine from this is, "I'm sitting in the corner, feeling glad, got no money coming in, but I can't be sad. That was the best cup of coffee I ever had." So, on that subject, a short slurp. Cheers. And yes, I've got my Jethro Tull mug out, especially for you on this very special video. Yes, this is a very special episode. Now, Inside being a very bright and positive number, it was the single released from the album, the follow-up single to Witch's Promise and Teacher. So here is the UK edition that was released with the Chrysalis label. Here is a Dutch copy. And in other territories, they were still on the Pink Island label in Europe. The Italian edition that is based on the album cover. And the French edition. Amazing psychedelic cover on the German edition. And the Spanish edition, which tells us that Inside is Dentro, and the B-side, Alive and Well and Living In, is Vivo y Bien y Viviéndolo. It was also released as a single in the US by Reprise. They did not use Alive and Well and Living In as the B-side. They left that off completely, having left it off the album, and instead used A Time for Everything on the flip. And finally, there is the US commercial edition, the white label version, of course, being the promo. One thing that gives the song Inside its bright character is that there's an unusual instrument on there. Ian Anderson is playing the balalaika. And apart from that little bit of Russian influence, there's a bit of German influence on the song by way of America. Ian has admitted that the song's melody bears a striking resemblance to Wooden Heart by Elvis Presley from the movie G.I. Blues, which is a very silly song, very silly clip from that movie you'll be able to see on YouTube, where he performs that song. But the song itself is actually an adaptation of an old German folk song called Muss I denn. So German by way of America from that song. The next song gets into the sardonic feel. It's a squabble between father and son. It is called Son, and Ian Anderson takes the two parts, I think giving the father the more stereotyped worst of it. And finally, there's that mention of Jeffrey in another song title, For Michael Collins, Jeffrey and Me. This is a song that we'll remember this month marks the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing. And this is a song about the Apollo 11 mission. Michael Collins being the member of the mission who had to stay up in the spacecraft while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin actually got to walk on the moon. So it's a song of being left out, a song of being a bit forgotten. And Michael Collins may have been forgotten a bit by history. Old Jeffrey makes three, as he does in the song Inside and as he does in this song title. So that's side one. Side two of Benefit begins with To Cry You a Song. And this is a very riffy, guitar-heavy number. This is a very guitar-heavy album. Martin Barre's electric guitar is very prominent. We tend to associate all the electric playing on Jethro Tull records with Martin Barre and all the acoustic with Ian Anderson. That's really not the case here. There's a lot of Ian Anderson playing electric throughout, so we often hear both Ian and Martin playing electric or both Ian and Martin playing acoustic on this album. And To Cry You a Song is a case in point. There's harmony work between Ian and Martin, both on electric, as well as overdubbed multiple lead guitars by Martin, and even a snatch of Leslie effected guitars. Martin has acknowledged that the song is very strongly influenced by Blind Faith. He didn't mention the song, but it's obviously Had to Cry Today. And if you saw the video I did recently for Blind Faith, I spoke about the use of the minor pentatonic scale in that song. And To Cry You a Song is built on that same on the same scale as a framework, but it's decorated in a certain way. I'll try to put an insert here where I demonstrate how that works. To Cry You a Song has a great deal in common with Had to Cry Today, right down to both having the word cry in the title, and both being based on that G minor pentatonic scale. But Jethro Tull's version of that scale doesn't stick to the scale. They add what I think of as little twiddles, where each note is accompanied by the note a semitone below it. It's neighbor below. So becomes... If you take just the scale of the, say the backbone of the notes that are used in the riff for To Cry You a Song, they're like this. But becomes and becomes. So the full riff ends up as. And you get a tension between the simplicity of that pentatonic scale, which your ear still recognizes as being the framework that's happening in this music, and the chromaticism of all those extra notes that wouldn't go all together in even a full major or minor scale. Again, this is very guitar heavy. The whole album is very guitar heavy. The mix very prominently features the guitar throughout. The guitar and vocals are way up front. Even though John Evans' piano gives the album a very specific feel, it does tend to get buried under the guitar. Drums and bass are not well recorded. The drums sound rather tinny, and the bass is pretty much buried under everything. The next song, A Time for Everything, is very much an example of the use of very extreme guitar sounds. There is in particular a very prominent piercing feedback note that lasts over 4 bars of the song. The song itself is another example of Ian Anderson projecting himself into the being of a much older man. In particular, the lyrics ruminate on 50 years of life. 50 years, and I'm filled with tears and joys I never cried. Again, that world weariness coming from a 22-year-old man. Next track is Teacher, but it's not the version that's on that single I showed earlier. Reprise Records in the USA wanted Jethro Tull to make Teacher more palatable for the radio audience because they were planning to release their version of the single. And the English version wasn't considered commercial enough. And they wanted to hear the flute on it in particular, which is not played on the original single. So Ian Anderson tried just overdubbing the flute on the original record, and that didn't work. So they just went back and re-recorded the whole song from scratch in a more up-tempo version. And that's what we hear here. That's what was also released as a single in the USA. I'll show that later. And since I mentioned Reprise, I should also show the actual record label. This is the 1970 label. If you go on Discogs, they'll tell you this is a second pressing, the first pressing being the one with an orange bar on the top. I'm not convinced that that's the case. I think that there are 2 different first pressings. This just is the one that was pressed at a given pressing plant, and they were using different labels at different plants. This is not my original copy from 1970. I no longer have that, but it does still have an original 1970 inner sleeve featuring a list of artists from Reprise Records. So Teacher on this album also features, as did the single version, John Evan playing organ. He'd played, I think, only piano up until this point on the American track listing. Then on the last 3 songs, we hear him switching to organ. Teacher takes the place of Inside, which was originally on side 2 of the British edition. Inside replacing Alive and Well and Living In on side 1. Next song, Play in Time, is the closest thing to another happy song after Inside. A song about making music and a bit of a rumination on Jethro Tull's move away from the blues, which is how they'd started, of course, on the This Was album. The line is, "Blues was my favorite color till I looked around and found another song that I feel like singing." Interesting thing musically about that song is the way it moves to an instrumental break in triple time. It's somewhat reminiscent of the Beatles' "We Can Work It Out," the way the bridge goes to a few bars of triple time from a song that's basically in 4. And finally, beautiful acoustic ballad to round off the album. Again, Martin Barre and Ian Anderson both on the finger-picked acoustic guitars. John Evan on a very solemn organ. The song has a classical feel, breaks into an up-tempo section for the chorus with a madly whirling tambourine. And the lyrics feature a made-up character, Saucity, meant to be a girl's name, but just a made-up name, and somehow a pun on society, not referring to society as a whole, but high society, the upper class person who Ian Anderson is displaying a bit of slightly disappointed or possibly even contemptuous feelings towards. So that's the album. Going back to the Witch's Promise single, this again is how it was released in the UK. Notice the Chrysalis logo. This is a German copy, which is with the same cover, just not the Chrysalis logo, a Chrysalis production credit, and a white version of the back, which I think works better. And here is a Swedish version, which has the same artwork as the British, but is worth showing because it comes on blue vinyl. And also the same is the Spanish edition, but this, like the other Spanish single, gives us the translations. So the songs here are Promesa de Bruja and El Profesor. This is the German edition. And this, the French. Here is the promotional white label from Reprise with Teacher on the B-side. So I'm not sure why they made such a fuss about having to get a commercial version of Teacher, and then they relegated it to the B-side and put their little star on the Witch's Promise side. But Teacher is very much the one that got airplay in America, not Witch's Promise by any means. And here is Benefit as it was released in the UK, with Alive and Well and Living In intact on the track listing, otherwise the cover pretty much the same. And again on the green Chrysalis label, although with an Island catalog number and an Island logo at the top. And with one more short slurp, I will sign off and say thank you very much for watching. Be well, and talk with you again soon. Bye-bye for now.